here the day before spring break to listen to the presentations of research by faculty. I chose to present on this particular research of mine for this occasion because it is quite interdisciplinary. As I will try to give you a short presentation now, it draws on significant bodies of work in sociology, in psychology, and also to a certain extent philosophy. This has been a very interesting and exciting intellectual journey for me as I ventured into these slightly less known disciplines. And I look forward to getting your feedback on this project. First of all, what is this project about? It is an edited book project that I'm editing. And it is especially meaningful for me in that respect because too often in our discipline of international relations, we have a sort of untold division of labor where, you know, American or British scholars develop a theoretical framework and we provide different case studies. In this project, I've attempted to do just the opposite. I have developed a theoretical framework on conflict resolution of my own, and then have invited a number of scholars to do case study contributions. It is set to be published by Routledge next year. So I'm just in the final stages of gathering all the contributions. What makes this project maybe slightly unsuitable for this type of a presentation is that my work has been, as I said, focused on providing a theoretical and conceptual framework, and therefore I will not be presenting my own empirical results. I will be giving some examples of empirical results that have been provided by the contributors to the volume. I mean, the main question that I'm interested in is how do international or ethno-national conflicts become protracted? Why do conflict parties resist and or oppose peace attempts despite obvious benefits? And what can be done to facilitate the resolution of such conflicts? Being situated in Turkey, we're not totally unfamiliar to such protracted conflicts. Cyprus conflict is a very clear example. And despite numerous rounds of direct, indirect talks, mediation by the United Nations Secretary General, pressure from various countries like United States, Britain, and the European Union, the conflict has resisted all forms of resolution attempts. So conflict resolution is an interesting subfield within our discipline, which has both theoretical and also practical policy-oriented contributions. And very simply, one can discern two lines of research within that broader field. Rationalist explanations of conflict or approaches to conflict resolution state that conflicts become protracted because they serve the interests of elites and other actors. So both elites in Cyprus and other community actors have an interest in continuing the conflict. That's why so far efforts have been ill-founded. And the solution within the rationalist framework is changing incentive structures. So it was hoped that EU membership would be a way of changing the incentive structures of elites, but it has not been that way. On the other hand, there are social psychological explanations, which state that conflicts become protracted because of identity images, the way identity formation processes work through in-group and out-group differentiation, because of embedded enemy images and prejudices, and these tend to be immune to changing incentives more or less, and people tend to continue the conflict because they become, to a certain extent, psychologically attached to the conflict. They find meaning in the conflict. and socio-psychological approaches to conflict resolution that work at changing individual and societal attitudes and beliefs. For example, we have a good example going on currently on our campus. It's Turkey-Armenia peace talks conducted between students, I think, facilitated by the OIP. So then socio-psychological approaches try to bring together in the form of second-track diplomacy, either diplomats or students or representatives of the public in a group, let them work all their prejudices against one another, try to formulate alternative approaches to conflict. My contribution to this literature is more inclined towards the social psychological explanations. It is an additional and a complementary perspective. And the argument is that conflicts become protracted because conflict resolution generates what I will explain later, ontological insecurity at state, group, individual levels. And this ontological insecurity sets in motion various processes that reproduce and reactivate the conflicts. So what do we mean by ontological security or insecurity? Here are pictures of a prominent Scottish psychiatrist, Randy Lang. On the left-hand side, on the right-hand side is the prominent British sociologist Anthony Giddens. And basically, I will work with Giddens' definition of ontological security, insecurity. He kind of starts out on the basis of an example of the relationship between a child and a caregiver. And each one of us who has raised a child knows how important routines are to the proper raising of a child. So then Giddens, also drawing on previous work by psychologists, argues that the formation of a basic trust through which the infant makes sense of himself, the caregiver, and the broader world he or she is situated in provides a fundamental sense of security. So for Giddens, ontological security is a formed framework of existence of such sense of security of the self, which is based on routines, and it enables the individual to answer existential questions about who am I, what is the world, how am I different, what makes me different, what makes me unique, and also enables individuals to bracket out questions about themselves, others, and the object world. So we have to have a formed framework of ontological security, a framework within which we answer all sorts of existential questions about ourselves in order to go on and carry on with our everyday activity.
Why is he reading this book, the Ashley Book of Knots?
I mean, I googled and this is the only photo I found.
So this has nothing to do with...
No.
Knots is not the conflicts.
No, it's not related to the presentation at all. Us as international relations scholars, we like to work on security. We like to analyze questions of international security, national security. But the concept of ontological security is rather new and foreign to us, because for the time being we have concerned ourselves primarily with the notion of physical security, where we have in mind, in case of states, the security of the population and territorial integrity, so the body of the state. And the main concern is ensuring survival. Security means being free of dangers and threats posed by external actors. And the main emotion or drive associated with physical security being fear. However, when we set out to apply this notion of ontological security, which has been developed to understand the individual and his relations with others and the outside world, then we're talking about security of the self rather than of the body. So security of the identity, security of the being, and the meaning world through which an actor makes sense of the external environment. And the main concern then becomes stability, able to be going on as usual. And thirdly, then maintaining ontological security relies on maintaining a certain self-narrative about oneself, being able to make the distinctions between self and others, and the main feeling drive associated with ontological security is anxiety. So a number of scholars in international relations in recent years have argued that states, or we can think of other political actors, not only pursue physical security, kind of protection from external threats that are directed at survival, but they also pursue a sense of ontological security, a sense of continuity of being in the world, and a sense of stability and maintaining certain identity narratives and making distinction between self and other. So my project then builds on this growing literature on ontological security in international relations, and I apply it to the specific subfield of conflict resolution. So I did not stop here. As I told you, this has been kind of an interesting intellectual journey for me. And, I was trying to really grasp the distinction between ontological security and other notions of security. And then for that, I ventured a little into philosophy to look at ways in which how anxiety has been distinguished from fear. And we can discuss, this is where, the distinguishing characteristic of ontological security lies. So now you have the picture of Kierkegaard here. Also, Heidegger has written a lot about the distinction between fear and anxiety. And the argument that is common to both is that fear is always directed at an object, which can be faced, analyzed, attacked, endured. But anxiety is something different. Anxiety is characterized by the fact that what threatens lies nowhere. And that anxiety does not know in the face of which it is anxious. There is a perfect example: anxiety about death versus fear of death. Most of us are actually very anxious about death, because no one knows what lies after. So our concern about death stems from this fundamental anxiety that we're not going to be able to continue our being, the form of existence as we know it. We don't know what's going to happen next. But what we often do is that we try to control or cope with this fundamental anxiety about death by converting into fears of death. So we convert this fundamental anxiety into fears. And we say that I am afraid of flying in an airplane because I'm afraid the plane will go down. Or I'm afraid of driving because there may be an accident. I'm afraid of heights, etc. So this is the relationship between anxiety and fears. Anxiety is very fundamental, pervasive, and existential. But what often happens at an individual level is that we try to convert it into fears, because fear is something that we can deal with, we can cope, and we can defend. So this is exactly something that states also do. They try to help, or they try to create a setting within which individuals living within states can cope with their various ontological insecurities or fundamental anxieties by establishing regimes of fear, identifying this is the threatening enemy out there. We should all gather together and try to protect ourselves. So anxieties are often dealt with by turning it into objects of fear. So based on this theoretical musings, then I arrive at how this may be applied to the discussion of conflict resolution. So basically, my arguments are threefold: that actors in international relations pursue ontological as well as physical security. We think about the Cyprus conflict, the Cypriots are concerned about their ontological security, Turkey's Kurdish conflict, Kurds versus Turks. And actually, conflict is a situation which generates, to varying degrees, physical insecurities. In a conflict, you're afraid of death, because that is always the threat of violence, threat of attack, etc. But conflicts also generate, while they generate physical insecurity and fear, they also generate a system of ontological security by establishing definite objects of fear, differentiating friends from enemies, and putting before anything else the necessity for survival. So when we enter into a process of conflict resolution, I argue that this relationship starts to work backwards. Conflict resolution promises to end fears and say that this conflict is going to end once and for all, there will be peace established, and you don't need to fear any longer. But when you begin to suppress or resolve fears, then what you unleash are anxieties, a sense of ontological insecurity, because the set of meanings within which individuals, as well as states and political actors, made sense of their being in relation to others becomes confused. The set of narratives and habits they have developed no longer work, and this generates a feeling of insecurity. I'm going to give a number of examples if I have time. For example, we can give the example of Cypriot, the island of Cyprus being divided by a green line for many years. And what do individuals experience when they're able to first cross the green line, when it was opened in 2004? There are many anthropological studies of, how individuals who crossed the green line for the first time experienced or gave meaning to this experience. And there is a fundamental sense of being disturbed by what one sees, because Greek Cypriots, for example, imagine the area of Turkish-controlled Cyprus to be like an oasis, and very beautiful, pretty. That's what we were told, for example, individuals say, and what we saw was fundamentally different. And I'm very disturbed by the fact, because they have been raised and developed in a narrative where they think that the other side is, kind of like a promised land. So basically, this is my framework, which sets out different pathways through which conflicts may arrive at peace. So Cyprus conflict, Turkey's Kurdish conflict, Israel-Palestine conflict, etc., we can all characterize them as stable conflicts. There is threat of physical insecurity, but on the other hand, the set of identities, images, and narratives have been quite firmly established. Then from stable conflicts, you move into a state of heightened anxiety and lowered fears when you enter into a process of conflict resolution. So basically, with conflict resolution, you end up in the upper left-hand quadrant. conflict is in the process of being resolved. There are various attempts and initiatives. Fear is being reduced, but you're at a situation of heightened anxiety. So what I say basically is that conflict resolution cannot only work through addressing fears, because if it only addresses threats to physical insecurity, then you arrive at this upper left-hand quadrant. What you need is a process that also lowers anxieties by creating alternative narratives of identity, alternative ways to make distinctions between self and other, and new habits and routines around which identity can be settled. Yes, Burak?
What is the difference between stable conflict and unstable conflict?
I didn't explain this because of lack of time. Sometimes conflicts become also unstable whilst the threat of physical insecurity is still high. For example, one can say the EU accession process for Cyprus created this kind of heightened anxiety. At the same time, conflict was unresolved. It made the conflict more unstable because now there is also this notion of being part of a broader Europe within which Greek and Turkish Cypriot communities are situated in. So that may be a way to start resolving the conflict, or you may go backward from that to a situation of stable conflict. So in order to arrive at peace then, the third process needs to unfold, that there needs to be a process of coping with peace anxieties through formulating alternative self-narratives that resituate the self in relation to others and that become embedded in new habits and routines. Okay, finally, I'd like to give you a picture of the different cases that are studied in the volume. In terms of stable conflicts, contributors examine Cyprus, Israel, Palestine, and the Kurdish conflict. Northern Ireland is, for example, another interesting example, because in Northern Ireland what we have is a seemingly successful peace process. But we see that even though this is considered more or less a success story, you have eruptions of violence in other contexts and in other settings. For example, about on which days of the week the British flag is going to be aired and vice versa. So more, limited communal violence. So we then argue that, Northern Ireland case is a conflict in transformation. It has not yet arrived at a state of peace, because peace anxieties have not been adequately dealt with. Now, for a situation of peace, then we have a number of case studies from Nordic conflicts, which were previously resolved in the early 1900s. And the contributors study how one set of narratives within which the conflict was situated have been replaced by another set of narratives in which it became possible to really ground peace. So finally, I have some pictures in the context of Turkey's Kurdish conflict. For example, on the upper left side is the Habur crossing episode, which happened in year 2009, when the group of PKK fighters were returned to Turkey and they were embraced. Their arrival was celebrated by large groups of Kurdish people in southeastern Turkey. This was the episode that actually killed the first attempt at a peace process in Turkey's Kurdish conflict. Because while the Kurds interpreted this as the arrival of heroes, from the perspective of the Turkish population in Turkey, this was a major betrayal and embracing of terrorists. And this happened because such a sense of there hasn't been an attempt to generate a sense of ontological security while trying to deal with various dimensions of the Kurdish conflict. At the lower left-hand side, I have a picture which shows actually the anxiety that Turkish people experience in the context of the disappearance of the acronym T.C. from various government sides. This is also very associated with the peace process of resolving Turkey's Kurdish conflict. And this shows the heightened anxieties as a result of the peace process that people are actually tracking, which government institutions are removing the TC acronym, and they put on their Facebook identities TC blah blah to indicate that they're actually, after protecting this acronym. And the final pictures are from Cyprus and also from Northern Ireland. Well, thank you for your patience. I kind of had to race through, but if I have maybe 5 minutes, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. Yes?
So, in your conflict diagram, there's an arrow going to peace, but none going out. Are you also analyzing that side, or? Where should it go? I don't know. That's my question. Are you also analyzing the effects of transition from peace to conflict states?
A return to conflict after peace. Well, basically my assumption, and that can be questioned, is that when you arrive at a situation of stable peace where you have actually generated a new framework of ontological security that contains the anxieties, there wouldn't be actually a return to the same conflict. But if we accept that, this anxiety is an existential state of individuals, and no matter what you do, what governments do, they cannot ultimately suppress it, one can say that maybe a new conflict, a new threat would be invented by governments, and a new situation would evolve. But however, the specific conflict we're discussing, there wouldn't be a return to it. That's how I conceptualized it.
Are there any related case studies that you have found?
About a new conflict emerging?
Maybe.
Well, actually not in the volume, but thank you for the suggestion. I will think about it, because too often that happens when one conflict is resolved. We can't speak about the end of the Cold War, for example. With the end of the Cold War, it could be argued that the United States and the Soviet Union, later Russia, entered into a state of fundamental anxiety because the other had disappeared. They had made sense of themselves and the world around them through Cold War identities. Then what happened next? We can say that with the events of 9/11, a new threat, a new conflict was formed, the creation of a new source of fear that would suppress anxieties and give the Americans a sense of who they are and their purpose in life. And maybe for Russia, we can discuss the Ukrainian crisis as a way of, suppressing the anxieties from losing the Soviet Empire and being contained to the smaller Russian Federation territory. So there could be examples of that, but unfortunately, there isn't a chapter devoted to such an analysis in the volume. Yes, Attila.
Obviously, there will be people or groups of people who benefit from conflicts. Now, is there a measurement of how much of the conflict is due to leaderships or groups of elites, or however you define them, benefiting from the continuation of the conflict, as opposed to ontological security?
Okay, so I also thought about this. You can delineate the different groups that benefit from the conflict in various ways. It could be elites because it serves their power purposes, or too often in conflict zones you have a war economy, So the people living there also make money out of conflict, etc. Of course, it's hard to measure the numeric weight. But I think we can say that these groups who benefit from conflict are in the overall minority within broader population. Then the puzzle that arises is that how come the interests of this minority come to prevail over the interests of majority? And I would say that it is due to the success of this minority groups, elites, to exploit the sense of anxiety with peace processes that the majority has, that gives them the ability to, keep the conflict going, maintain the conflict going. So rather than who has more weight, I think we should ask the question of how come the minority elite is able to convince others and establish a legitimate ground for the continuation of conflict. Yes, Ulash?
I'm curious how modular, I like the theory, obviously, but I'm curious how modular this theory is and how well it will travel, say, from armed conflict situations to more sort of peaceful, institutionalized, pacific modes of political struggle, say, elections, right? Mm-hmm. To what extent we could apply this framework to strategies that some of the political leaders use to perhaps stoke anxiety in order to mobilize a certain part of the electorate, or maybe to de-link or realign the electorate, maybe destabilize the markers of certainty so that fears turn into anxieties, or provide a point for the anxiety to congeal into fear. Right? For instance, in Turkish case, it would be the Sharia is coming. Right? So, anyways,
it does not need to be directed as external sources of threat. The enemy could be within, and such. We can think about the fear of migrants in West European societies, how they became the scapegoat of various difficulties that West European societies go through. I mean, actually, to tell you the truth, I sense that, behind this is a very general theory of politics that probably others before me have developed to a greater extent, but remain kind of inaccessible to a more mainstream political science audience before, because it's more philosophical. I tried to kind of carve out a special area for myself that I can manage, and I said, I'm going to study ontological security and conflict resolution. But I do see, the applications could be much broader, and I hope others will take it up. Yes, Shulman?
I thought it's also a very valuable contribution to theory. One thing I'm quite curious about it, is there a way to combine this in a mutually reinforcing way with incentive structure somehow? Because while ontological security is extremely important, as we have seen in the case of Cyprus, incentive structures still have an impact. For instance, the EU membership had two different incentive structure mechanisms for the Turkish Cypriots versus Greek Cypriots, and the incentives were very asymmetric. In the case of Turkish Cypriots, in the end, they said overwhelmingly yes to the Annan plan because they had the incentive of getting it into the EU. Whereas for the Greek Cypriots, it was almost like a done deal. They had the blank check that even if they said no to the referendum, they would have entered the EU. And through this incentive mechanism, they thought that, well, we will have even more leverage when we're in the EU, which they did actually. The conflict is protracted. But I think this asymmetric incentives, in addition to the ontological security issues, which were fueled actually throughout the process, had an impact. So
I think that's, that's a very good question, and I have often thought about this because the contributor is writing Cyprus conflict is a Greek Cypriot. So I always thought, you know, what has been the Turkish Cypriot ontological security concerns. But I think I could say this. I mean, all solution attempts to the Cyprus conflict that are devised by various international actors have this mentality in mind that, you know, if a solution is found in terms of a working legal framework, then out of this, a common Cypriot identity will evolve, and Greek and Turkish Cypriots will gradually shed their differences and come and be united in this joint Cypriot identity. But I think, you know, this thought of, you know, okay, the next day we'll all be Cypriots kind of thing, generates anxiety and ontological insecurity, because they have, until that time, formed narratives, habits, and routines around these different Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot identities. Although they haven't existed eternally, you know, British colonial period is a different story, but at least it's been in place for 50, 60 years. So what would have happened if the Annan plan had been accepted? I think that if Annan plan had been accepted and with the Turkish Cypriots voting in favor of it, then it would be the turn of the Turkish Cypriots, initially attracted by the incentive of EU membership, but after having acquired it, to experience ontological insecurity. Because then I think even, you know, after Annan plan being accepted, Cyprus being an EU member, they would still be in a conflict in resolution stage. So that maybe the Cyprus conflict as we know it wouldn't have erupted all over again, but the kinds of processes we observe in Northern Ireland, for example, limited violence between different nationalist groups, could emerge, because the Turkish Cypriots, okay, they have been attracted by the incentives, but they wouldn't have developed the kind of meaning structure within which they, you know, give legitimacy to their choice. You see what I mean? I think that's where ontological security would have still played a role. Yes?
Maybe suggestion, maybe you can place war, ceasefire, terrorism into those boxes.
Actually, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a difference between Cyprus conflict, where no overt violence has happened for many years, and the difference with the conflict in Syria, where violence is always a day-to-day matter. I've had comments in various presentations that in such situations, people don't care about ontological security, dignity, they just care about saving their lives. So that is, I think, a legitimate criticism in that the stable conflict box includes qualitatively very different types of conflicts, and that the processes may unfold quite differently, the weight of ontological physical security, as has been asked, in different types of conflict. Because, you know, all cases that I have been looking at, also Israel-Palestine, there is limited violence. Turkish-Kurdish conflict, again, you know, there is violence, but again, limited and contained. So, you know, that could be some grounds for criticism, I think. Okay, then I turn the floor.